Hello everyone, I'm Doug Reeves. I'm here today to talk about fearless schools, building resilience for every student, teacher, and leader. I work at the Equity and Excellence Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that has served schools all around the world, in all 50 US states and more than 40 countries. In every continent, we are deeply committed to supporting your success. During the pandemic, we provided free webinars to more than 30,000 educators and school leaders around the world. And I hope that you will allow us to serve you as well. You can find more at creativeleadership.net, and I've also in the handouts put my personal contact information for you. I know this is a challenging and difficult time, but together I know that the best interests of students and the nations that we serve will come to the fore. So let us get to work. I want to make sure that you understand that when it comes to the kind of support that we offer, there is no bureaucracy. I've even included my personal cell phone number in your handouts, as well as how to get a hold of me on Twitter, by email, and offering the expertise that we can. I'm not saying that we've got all the answers, but I am saying that with a team of colleagues with broad levels of expertise around the world, we may be able to support you as well, and I hope you would consider calling on us. The webinars that we offer are always free, and we're there to help you and serve you. Now, let me begin our discussion with this provocative question. Which hospital would you rather go to? The hospital that reports a higher error rate by physicians, staff, and nurses, or the second hospital that has a lower error rate? Well, gosh, if you ask me, wouldn't you rather go to the hospital with a lower error rate? That question was posed by Harvard professor Amy Edmondson. And in studies that she has done over the course of 20 years, she says, wait a minute, be careful of the low error rate, because what that might mean is simply who are so fearful of feedback that they simply don't report it. A fearless hospital, just like fearless schools, are the ones who admit their mistakes and learn from them. And a learning organization depends upon the candid, open acknowledgement of mistakes. So when everything looks rosy and everything looks perfect, ask yourself, is the hospital or the school really perfect, or are the errors simply unreported? In today's discussion, what I want to do is focus on three big ideas. First, the trust imperative. A learning organization depends upon trust, and trust depends upon fearlessness, as we will discuss. Second, resilience. What happens when we do get knocked down? Certainly during this pandemic and the global shutdown of schools and other institutions, we've all suffered a few hard knocks. How do we bounce back from that? And the evidence, both emotionally and physically, on how resilience happens can inform us today. And finally, fearlessness in practice. Exactly what does that mean for our day-to-day operations in schools and educational institutions? Let us begin with the trust imperative. The evidence from Professor Edmondson and others around the world conclude the following. When there's a high trust organization, high levels of psychological safety, there's higher levels of learning. That's true in the classroom. You've seen it. When a student is fearful to make a mistake, they remain silent. Doesn't mean that they're really avoiding mistakes, but they'd rather completely be silent than they would risk making a mistake because mistakes are so embarrassing. That's what happens also when teachers only call on students who raise their hand. They already know the answer, and the students who don't know are humiliated into silence. That is not a learning environment. A high trust environment means greater learning because we can fearlessly make mistakes, get feedback, and improve our performance. High psychological trust environments also have greater resilience, bouncing back from defeat, bouncing back from disappointment. We'll talk about that in a few moments, how we can even enhance that from the classroom to your governing boardroom. They have better collaboration. Part of collaboration means I'm willing to admit what I don't know, willing to admit that I need some help and ask my colleagues. And fourth, there's deeper communication. When we really are willing to listen more and talk less, I don't have to cover up what I don't know, but I'm willing to candidly acknowledge in a psychologically safe environment what I don't know and collaborate more with my colleagues. So I want you to take about 30 seconds now and respond to this prompt. When you're in a high trust environment, how do you feel? Take about 30 seconds. Now, it's not unusual that people in a high trust environment will tell me that they not only feel psychologically safe and physically safe, they feel that they can ask questions, they feel that they can be vulnerable without any accusation of incompetence. But here's the problem with us as educators. The more years we have in our profession, the more our personal and professional identity is all wrapped up in our expertise. It happens with leaders as well. I'm the doctor, take 2 of these, call me in the morning because I've got the answers. It's a lot harder to be able to say, I don't know the answer to that. Or maybe I knew the answer a year ago, but a lot has changed in the last 12 months. Let's learn together how we can solve this problem and explore different alternatives. That willingness to explore is at the heart of psychological safety and at the heart of a high trust environment. And part of what we really want to encourage is the ability to respond to stress and anxiety. Now think about this. The last year, both in terms of public health and economics, have been some of the most stressful ones in decades. Certainly we've seen that in schools with family disruption, unemployment, economic disruption, and uncertainty. In fact, it's the latter part, uncertainty, that people tell me around the world matters most. Just make a decision, but day to day, I literally don't know if I have a job, don't know where to put my kids, don't know what to do at home. I'm encouraging you to make the best call you can and help relieve some of that stress and anxiety with higher levels of clarity and certainty. Now, we also have students who are feeling very anxious. If you want to see a student who is psychologically fearful, have them walk into a classroom 6 months from now and wonder if I'm able to read as well as my colleagues. Adolescents in particular fear incompetence. And the mistake that so many schools are making is saying, well, because of the global pandemic, I've got to accelerate social and emotional learning, failing to remember that learning is the heart of relieving stress and anxiety, helping our students feel competent, helping them know that they're getting better all the time. And it doesn't have to be with the fanciest technology. I've worked in high poverty countries around the world where all we can manage maybe is a brief cell phone call, but even on that, we can build relationships between students and teachers, read aloud, hold pictures, and maintain the best structure that we can to help students know we love them, we care about them, and their stress and anxiety can be at least partially relieved by knowing that they're getting better all the time. And what about teacher and administrator stress and anxiety? The uncertainty about our jobs is also provoking them, as well as the uncertain feeling that there's more and more to do and less time to do it. We have to be careful about wondering that when this pandemic is over, people will say, well, thank goodness that's over. Now we can go back to what we were doing before. Indeed, we've learned a few things, and there are lessons from this pandemic that we all must apply. So let's think about the consequences of stress and anxiety. There's physical consequences, there's psychological consequences, there's professional consequences, and all of those come together if we let stress and anxiety get the better to us. The antidote to stress and anxiety is this feeling of progress, letting us know not just year to year, decade to decade, but literally moment to moment, are we getting better? I want you to think, for example, about a great music class, maybe a great team athletic coach who literally minute to minute has those students knowing that they're getting better. Think about the music class. The feedback is higher, lower, faster, slower, louder, softer. You can hear with your own ears in a 10-minute observation the power of feedback and that the students are getting better, and you'll see them sitting up straighter and being more confident. You'll see students who miss some baskets in one game or miss goals in a different game, and then with coaching, with feedback, get better and better in a matter of minutes. That's the sort of antidote to stress and anxiety that you and I provide. That immediate feedback, immediate support that all of our students need. And if we fail to address that, then the physical, psychological, and professional consequences of stress and anxiety come to the fore. So, I want you to think about how we can address psychological safety and building trust in our organizations. Number one, we have to make sure that we validate mistakes, but let's be clear. There's different sorts of mistakes. There's careless mistakes. There's experimental mistakes, which are testing hypotheses. You know, if you always know the right answer, it's not research. It's not an experiment. So experimental mistakes mean we're going to try something that may not work. That is a valid mistake as long as we learn from it. And of course, there are learning mistakes, analyzing the root cause and the experiment of every experiment with conditions. So let us distinguish these types of mistakes, because I don't want you to leave this session thinking that psychological safety means we're just indifferent to mistakes. We want the right kind of mistakes. So for example, a careless mistake might include a failure to observe classrooms. I've seen that all over the world, where we go to virtual classrooms and administrators and coaches are not there watching. Friends, think of it this way. If you were back in a physical school and you walked down the hallway and all the windows were covered and the door was locked and someone put chewing gum in the keyhole, that would be a big problem. The same is true if a virtual class is going on and you can't observe it. You absolutely, whether it's virtual or whether it's live, have to have the opportunity to observe every classroom. That is our job as leaders and as coaches. Failure to provide immediate and accurate feedback. I worry that around the world I see people engaging in walkthroughs or rounds or whatever you want to call it, which may be interesting, but it's like the tale of the three blind men and the elephant. Three people walk in and they see different things, and the teacher is left with a vacuum of information wondering what's going on. That increases their stress and anxiety, increases that climate of psychological fear. If you're going to go into a classroom, live or virtual, you owe it to the teacher the same day, not with an email, not with a Google form, but face-to-face or at least a telephone call. Here's what I saw. Doug, when I was in your classroom, I really appreciated how you varied the presentation with checks for understanding with students. However, Doug, I noticed that there were 5 students who simply were disengaged. You only called on those who raised their hands. So Doug, next time I come to your classroom, I just want to make sure that every student is engaged. I really appreciated the opportunity to observe you, and I'll see you again in a few weeks. Now that specific, clear feedback didn't require a checklist, didn't require an email, and lets me know exactly what you saw. And could I just add one more thing from a teacher's point of view? Before you provide feedback to the teacher, ask them what they saw. Because sometimes teachers will know about things in a classroom that you and I as observers might not have seen. Always give the teacher the opportunity to say what they saw first. So the first careless mistake was failure to observe. The second careless mistake was failure to provide immediate and accurate feedback. The third careless mistake is failure to provide multi-channel communication. I grieve that right now, during this shutdown, too many people have said, well, I sent the staff an email. I sent parents and students an email. Friends, people are getting hundreds, even more emails in their boxes. We need to have multi-channel communication, email and text and old-fashioned calls. Some of the least used and yet most important technology is the old-fashioned telephone. Person-to-person contact with students to find out what is really going on. And there may be more channels than that, using the Postal Service if necessary, to make sure that we're communicating with students. Don't settle for simply one-way communication. Now, let us consider experimental mistakes. Here's what you and I can do to create learning organizations in fearless schools. For example, let's try a new technology. We've seen dozens of new ones come out in the last few months, and what if it doesn't work? What if it falls flat? One study recently reported that more than 60% of instructional technology initiatives are simply unused because they didn't measure up to the vendor promises. That's okay as long as we admit it. We tried it and it didn't work. That's how science advances. The scientist's creed is we learn more from error than from uncertainty. So make those mistakes boldly, but share the mistakes, what didn't work with colleagues, and recognize sometimes new technologies, like everything else, requires practice to be able to implement successfully. We might try some new student engagement techniques that don't work. For example, a moment ago I suggested that you not let any student opt out. And you call on them, but what happens if they just say, I don't know, or they refuse to respond? Building a culture in which it's safe to ask for help, safe to say, I need to phone a friend, safe to say, I can give you a partial answer but not the whole answer. That's how we get higher levels of engagement. And that may require some work with your students. We have many, many different cultures that we're serving in these schools all around the world. And I recognize that in some cultures, it's really difficult for students to acknowledge a mistake or to ask for help. If we want to build a fearless school, we have to work on creating the culture in which it is okay, in fact, essential to ask for help. And new faculty support techniques. I worry about all the new people joining our profession right now who have been hired. They got hired because we think that they know everything, but you and I have been first-year teachers. We know what it's like to be one page ahead of our students and maybe one day ahead of them in the curriculum. It's nerve-wracking. We work from 6 in the morning until midnight and are exhausted. Friends, we need to provide those colleagues with support. And sometimes the faculty support that we provide is not what they need. My recommendation to you is, rather than one more workshop, consider some one-to-one mentoring, maybe one faculty member supporting a newer faculty member on things like engagement and communication with parents, maybe another faculty member supporting on assessment and curriculum. We need that daily support, not just one more workshop, to help us learn how to succeed in this profession. So there's careless mistakes, there's experimental mistakes, and of course the pinnacle is learning mistakes. A learning mistake is where we quickly and publicly acknowledge, hey, I tried this and it didn't work. In fact, if you're a leader, the next time you're with your faculty, try opening the meeting with, friends, I'd like you to share with you my 2 biggest mistakes of the last month. That will be unusual coming from an authority figure who they think has got all the answers. But if you as a leader are willing to talk about the mistakes you make, then you are inviting everyone on the staff to be candid and open about their learning mistakes as well. And then we can analyze the root causes. Well, I tried this and it didn't work because I didn't have adequate connectivity on technology, or I didn't have adequate training and preparation, or I didn't first do checks for understanding with students. Analyze what the root causes are. It's easy to blame myself. Oh, it's all my fault. I must feel incompetent. Or blame the vendor, or whatever the case is. Blame is not a strategy, friends. Let's identify what the root causes are. That's the learning mistake that will really help our organization become more fearless. And of course, clear and persistent alternatives. If A didn't work, we try B. If B didn't work, we try C. If C didn't work, we try D. Always persistently going on to the next thing. That shows a pattern of resilience rather than this all or nothing thinking, well, I tried this for student engagement, so I guess no student engagement works. It means one strategy didn't work. We've got to be willing to try all the others, including asking our colleagues and listening to them. One of the great virtues that we can all learn from the tragedies of the last several months in the pandemic is that, as one school leader told me, we're all first-year teachers right now. We're all learning from scratch. And asking people across generational divides, and indeed across national boundaries, what's working for you is one of the best ways that we can learn together. Now, if we really believe in resilience, in bouncing back from disappointment and defeat, the essence of what fearless schools can do, then we need to really understand the root of what resilience is all about. There's a term in metallurgy called the modulus of resilience. Now, the modulus of resilience is about, envision the beams holding up a large building. If they were completely inflexible, then as soon as there was a slight tremor, the whole building would fall apart. If they're too flexible, then a wind will blow the building down. The modulus of resilience in metallurgy is this point at which that beam can bend but come back to its original position. Bend but not break. That's what we want to see. The modulus of resilience means we can and have been beaten down, but we can be resilient, coming back to our original condition. And that's exactly what we can learn from not only the metaphor of metallurgy, but from so many other cases as well. So what I want to try to do is show you some examples of what resilience really looks like and how we can apply that in schools. For example, we know that for personal resilience, bouncing back requires recovery. Ask any athlete who's had an injury. Requires structure. That means a trainer. Requires anticipation of setbacks. Nobody has a perfect road to recovery or resilience. It means accountability, keeping track of my wins, what Professor Teresa Amabile calls the progress principle, and celebration, not just a year from now, not a decade from now, but literally our day-to-day celebrations of how we're getting better and better. And let's think about emotional resilience as well. Emotional resilience requires a mission-driven focus. We're focused on the things that are most important for our nations and for the world, and that is the progress of our students. If we are going to write the history of how the world survived the pandemic, it'll be because of what you did. It'll be because of how teachers and leaders maintained educational systems even in the most challenging of circumstances. That focus on our mission is what will keep us going. It It requires relying upon our experience, thinking back to other times in your life where you've been beaten down, you persisted, and you demonstrated resilience. It requires focusing on the present. What can I do right now, today? I can learn from the past without being obsessed by the past. It requires what psychologists call an internal locus of control. One of the things that we can all do as educators and leaders is think in terms of 3 piles of factors that influence student achievement. One pile are things I can't control. I can't control COVID. I can't control student poverty. I can't control what happens in the home if parents give students access to alcohol or tobacco or weapons. That's all things I cannot control. There's things that I can influence, but not control. I can certainly influence engagement and attendance and even a degree of psychological fearlessness by my students. And there are things that I absolutely influence and control: the engagement of my lessons, the relevance of my lessons. Now think of those 3 piles. Things I cannot control or influence, things I can influence, and things that I can control. The heart of efficacy is having our work focused on those 2nd and 3rd piles, things I influence and things I control, and stop perseverating about the things that are outside of my locus of control. It means that we practice gratitude. The evidence is overwhelming that even in the most challenging of times, being grateful for what we have, even some psychologists recommend keeping a gratitude journal, is a key to resilience and recovery. And of course, don't forget the physical part of this. The evidence is clear. High-intensity exercise at every age, 90-year-olds doing just 7 or 8 minutes of high-intensity exercise helps our brain, helps our emotions, frankly, in controlled studies, better than some of the pharmaceuticals that are described to help us be more emotionally healthy. So now let us talk about organizational resilience, moving from the personal resilience to organizational resilience. The heart and soul of organizational resilience is that learning and innovation requires risk. Now, people will tell me, well, Doug, I'll try this idea you've got on feedback or on coaching or on effective grading practices, whatever the case might be, but you have to prove that it'll work first. No matter how many studies I have, that doesn't prove that it's going to work in your school. Trying new things requires risk. And risk means there will be some errors. There will be some application of how something might work best or needs to be tweaked to work in your schools. If you can't tolerate risk and error, you will never innovate. If you can't tolerate risk and error, then schools will still have desks in rows, teachers standing at the front as they did 200 years ago, and as they probably will 200 years from now in some schools, because people are so afraid of risk and error. The heart of organizational resilience is a willingness to take a risk, to make a mistake, to admit it, and to learn from it. So learning requires this combination of tolerating error and the celebration of learning mistakes. Now, that sounds good in theory. Why don't we do it? Because everybody says they value creativity. Everybody says they value innovation. But in an international study that I did of activities in schools that were designed to promote creativity and innovation, many of them said, but we want students to work independently and get it right the first time. That's the opposite of innovation and creativity. Innovation and creativity means trying and failing, bouncing back, and we have to have feedback systems that reward learning from those failures, and most of them don't. So let's get really specific about this. If we want to have fearless organizations and fearless schools, we better have fearless classrooms. So let's talk about some of the hallmarks of a fearless classroom. Number 1, equity sticks, or depending on your terminology, random calling. That means there is no fear of participation even when you don't know the answer. Equity sticks, oftentimes you see in the primary grades, are these bowls that have sticks with the name of every student in them, and teachers will draw them out. For larger classes, such as secondary school and even in college that I've seen these done, it simply means random calling on people. The rule is you raise your hand to ask a question, not to answer a question. If you want 100% engagement by your students, don't rely upon a few students to always raise their hand. Friends, during the pandemic shutdown, I watched a science class where one student for 45 minutes straight answered all the questions and all the other students were checked out because the teacher knew that he could rely upon that one student answering all the questions. That is a fearful classroom because most of the students are afraid of incompetence. They're afraid to be asked a question that they didn't know the answer to. So equity sticks are random calling. That's a hallmark of a fearless classroom. Secondly, there's got to be peer and teacher relationships that reflect confidence. There's never sarcasm. There's never emotional bullying. There's never snickering. We encourage one another, and we work colleague to colleague, peer to peer, to be able to solve problems together. And there is zero tolerance of that kind of sarcasm. One of the things that I grieve about is teachers think that they're being funny when they're being sarcastic, and it is in fact emotionally devastating to students. So no sarcasm, no bullying, and I'll just tell you this directly. If you don't want bullying in the hallways, you don't want bullying from one student to another, don't allow bullying by adults, because that cutting remark that teachers make when they think they're being funny is just as bad as when students do it. In fact, I would argue even worse. So let's talk about fearless practice. This is what really happens in fearless schools. Number one, it means authentic practice with real-time feedback. And we practice with a coach, not alone. Imagine that we're playing the international game of soccer, or in what most people would call football. And your worst nightmare as a coach has come true, and I'm on your team. And there I am trying to do a free kick, and I miss 10 in a row. But I'm lucky enough to have you or one of your colleagues as a coach, and they coach me on my stance, my approach, my foot position, and I make 10 in a row. Now think about that practice. I missed 10, I got immediate coaching and feedback, I made 10. Would that be a good practice? I think we would all agree that was a great practice. Lucky Doug to have such a great coach. What happens if I do the same thing at home with a math assignment, miss 10, make 10? That's called 50% and an F, failure. If we know what good practice is, it means getting coaching and feedback in real time, and homework doesn't accomplish that. It happens in class with the school. And so really be wary of things that we think are practice, but do not have the kind of fearless practice with coaching, with feedback, with immediate improvement. That's what we need to have. We need to have fearless dialogue. For example, fearless dialogue is never, anybody got any questions? Everybody with me? Fearless dialogue means that I'm asking for meaningful checks for understanding from my students. And fearless dialogue means, for example, that I'm going to be asking students, hey, Jerome, you provided 2 sources for that essay that you wrote, and I really appreciate that, but I'd like you to tell me and tell the class, what are a couple of sources that you considered but did not use? Why are the sources that you used more credible than the ones that you did not use? Now that's a meaningful check for understanding. And if all Jerome did was to copy that paper from the internet, believe me, he can't answer that question. Cassandra, I love the fact that you nailed the answer to that geometry proof, but I don't understand how you got from steps 2 to step 3. Please explain that to me and to the class, how you got from steps 2 to step 3. If all Cassandra did was get the right answer, thanks Khan Academy, or any number of other internet sources, then she's not going to be able to tell me that. A meaningful check for understanding requires fearless dialogue. And that requires not embarrassing students, allowing them to ask for help, allowing them some think time, allowing them to make a partial answer. But fearless dialogue means that students and I, and with one another, can talk about what we know and fearlessly talk about what we don't know. And friends, it requires fearless leadership. Fearless leadership requires consistent modeling of our own learning mistakes. I'll believe that there's fearless leadership when I hear the most senior educational officials at a school and indeed at a national level say, we tried this and it didn't work. We are so fixated on talking only about success that we talk a good game about innovation and creativity. But if we're not willing to talk about mistakes, that is a fearful environment. A fearless environment means we openly and candidly talk about our learning mistakes, how we learned from them, how we conducted the root cause analysis. And I'll believe leaders value innovation and creativity when they start every conversation about, here's a recent mistake I made and what I learned from it. And if you hear somebody disrespecting those learning mistakes, I encourage you to confront colleagues and students who are critical of other people's mistakes. Mistakes are how we learn as long as we're open and honest about them. Now let us talk about fearless change. In another keynote address, in another time, I'll talk about a new book that I've written called The New Model of Change Leadership. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to address fearless change right now. Because we really need to change leadership. The old model of change was, well, first of all, you got to change everybody's attitudes and beliefs. Bring them all into the large auditorium. Get them to believe in that inspirational speaker, like me. And then they'll say, oh, after 30 years of doing it wrong, thanks, Doug. Now I've seen the light. Now I'll do it right. Now, you and I know how silly that is, and yet that's still what people believe in. Ask 10 leaders, how do you have change happen? 9 out of 10 will say, well, the first thing you've got to do is get buy-in from everybody. Change their attitudes and beliefs, and then they'll change practice. And then maybe they'll change practice, and then finally, maybe there will be some evidence. We've been trying that for 40 years. That is an old and discredited model of change, and it doesn't work. What's the new model of change leadership? You start with practices. You do it even before there's buy-in, even before there's evidence of impact. You do the practice first, then immediately you measure evidence of impact. Along with Dr. Robert Aker, I wrote the book 100-Day Leader, and we're talking about how short-term wins yield long-term gains. In other words, what can I do literally in the next 100 days to show either I made a mistake and I'm going to learn from it, or I've made progress and I'm going to stick with it. Short-term wins, not these Stalinist 5-year plans, are how we really make improvements. And so it's practice first, then evidence, and then when people see the evidence, then there's buy-in. If you wait for buy-in before your next innovation or change, you'll be waiting 50 years from now. And I want to suggest that every time I've seen the toughest things work, things like changing in grading practices, things like changing in curriculum and assessment, things like changing in evaluation, it's because brave people were willing to do an experiment. They started it first. Then they showed dramatic gains in student achievement. Then they had the evidence that they shared with their colleagues, and then there was buy-in. And so I'm not offended in the least when people say, Doug, I think you're crazy, but I'll give it a try for 100 days. I'd much rather hear that than the illusion of buy-in, where people leave the auditorium smiling, go back and do the same thing they've been doing for the last 100 years. Now, if that's the new model of change leadership, we need our leadership to be focused. And the essence of focused leadership is practices, not programs. Friends, it's not what you buy, it's what you do. I'm terribly worried in one country that we serve on the African subcontinent, they're committed to professional learning communities. I totally support that. I've written about it, and I support the work of the late Dr. Rick Dufour and Dr. Rebecca Dufour. In fact, the last article that Dr. Dufour wrote before he passed away, he co-wrote with me, called The Futility of PLC Light. But in this country, there were more than 30 NGOs all trying to promote professional learning communities in different ways. Don't do a program. Focus on the practice. What exactly is it that we want in terms of professional learning communities as a practice, that you own it, that your name is on it, your school's name is on it, not external publishers or vendors. It's all about implementation and impact. I spoke to Professor John Hattie a couple of weeks ago, and his latest research is on implementation. I've done extensive research on that as well. And here's the interesting thing that I learned. And by the way, here's a good consumer alert. Researchers who are worth their salt will do what I've been encouraging you to do, talk about mistakes. So let me talk about one of mine. My mistake on implementation research was hypothesizing that implementation was a linear impact. So I had level 1, 2, 3, and 4. And with each progressive level of impact, I thought the impact on student achievement would get higher and higher and higher. In studying 36 different programs in literally thousands of schools, I was dead wrong. In fact, it was nonlinear. It's level 1, level 2, nothing happened. Level 3, nothing happened. Level 4, significant impact on student achievement. But, want to know what? A lot of people never get to level 4. Because after going to levels 1, 2, and 3, they'll say, well, gosh, that didn't work. Let's go buy another program. And so here they are again at level 1, 2, and 3. Well, that one didn't work either. Let's go buy another program. The essence of the implementation research says, if you're not going to have deep implementation, don't bother. Because half-hearted implementation is no better than, in some case worse than, no implementation at all. What I learned also in that research was what I called the rule of 6. You simply can't monitor and manage deep implementation of more than about 6 initiatives. So fearless leadership requires focused leadership, and that means focusing on no more than 6. And if you're going to get to that, it means that you better have a not to-do list. Now, how many times have you been involved in a professional learning exercise like this one, where you leave thinking, thanks a heck of a lot, more things that I have to do? So I want to turn the table on that and have you leave this session with a not to-do list, identifying things that you can take off the table and remove from your to-do list. Let me give you some examples that I've heard from teachers and education leaders around the world. For example, they're not going to have announcements and meetings anymore. Just yesterday, I was with a wonderful group of leaders who said, no more announcements. We're going to all just make little 5-minute videos for any announcements. People can listen to them again. They can share them, but we're not going to take time in meetings to make announcements. In fact, they structured their agenda so that every agenda item ends with a question mark, not a period. So it's all about problem solving and inquiry, not making announcements. They're giving up all kinds of alerts, responding to emails and texts in 30 seconds. If you're doing that, turn off the alerts. You don't need to respond in 30 seconds. You may think you're multitasking, but you're not. You're switch tasking, and the evidence is we lose concentration and lose energy every time we bounce back and forth. And so set some times, 3 times a day, to respond to emails and texts. When you do it in 30 seconds, you want to know what you're saying? Oh, I wasn't doing anything of particular importance. I was just sitting here waiting for the next email and text to come in. I know that's not true. You're busy people. You're helping students right then. Stop playing whack-a-mole trying to respond to every single student. I should explain that cultural reference. In American county fairs in rural areas, there's a game called whack-a-mole, where every time a rodent sticks his head up, someone tries to pound it down. But no matter which one you pound down here, another one comes up, and then you have to pound that one, and then another one comes up, and you have to pound that one. So while that may be kind of an obscure rural American reference, it resonates with education leaders all over this planet, because we all have too many things to do. One thing jumping up that we're trying to hit, while other things are popping up at the same time. So get rid of those alerts for incoming text and emails. Make sure that we stop using any observations without feedback. That's a waste of your time and the teacher's. Here's a sensitive one. Stop doing homework that doesn't have impact. Remember what I said about practice? Practice requires feedback. Practice requires coaching, and that never happens with most homework assignments. So I want to make sure that you take some time as you reflect on today's lesson to think about what's on your not-to-do list. Earlier I mentioned Professor Teresa Amabile. She's a splendid Harvard Business School professor who has written powerfully about what she calls the progress principle. And that is the notion not that we're just achieving long-term goals, but literally every day, every week, in short-term increments, making a little bit of progress. When students know that, and when we as adults know that, there's more positive emotions, she concludes. There's more goodwill toward our coworkers, able to celebrate and appreciate progress. There's higher levels of personal and job satisfaction. And I grieve that over the last few months, job satisfaction among educators has declined dramatically as we are more and more isolated. There's a greater sense of personal ownership of ideas, and, Professor Amabile says, higher levels of civility and courtesy. And something our world needs right now is the ability, even as we might disagree with one another, higher levels of civility and courtesy. That's also part of what creates a fearless environment for your school. And, of course, better communication. So let's think about the practical implementation of the progress principle in fearless schools. Number one, we move away from the classical unit assessments with 30, 40, 50 items to very short mini assessments. Indeed, I've seen teachers get to assessments with 3 or 4 items that they do right then in class with immediate feedback. Students leave a class in mathematics like they leave a music class, knowing that they're better when they walked in because they got immediate feedback, and if they made a mistake, they were able to fix it and get better and better. They move away from merely teacher evaluation to peer reviews and self-assessment. One of the practices that I've used as an educator myself, and I encourage the use around the globe, is what I've called the 3-column rubric, where the left-hand column specifies what I expect of my students. The middle column is a self-assessment. I don't take work that hasn't had a self-assessment first. And the right-hand column is only when the teacher disagrees with the student's self-assessment. I'll be happy to share with you copies of 3-column rubrics that I've created if you're interested. When I did that, it not only helped students carry the cognitive load of their work, it cut my grading time in half because I wasn't spending all this time telling students what they already knew. And weekly learning goals, even daily learning goals. Every time I'm in a classroom, I just ask students, what are we learning? What comes next? And when they can tell me, I know that they're poised for making that period of time they have with a teacher, however short or long, a learning environment. And as I said earlier, real progress depends upon not frantically trying to do many standards, but focusing on the power standards. Well, we've addressed a lot of different things in this conversation about fearless schools. We've talked about how fearless classrooms, fearless schools, fearless organization, fearless leadership can drive your resilience, make your environment more effective, and also have our job satisfaction as leaders and our students' learning satisfaction grow. I so much appreciate your willingness to engage with me, and we're going to have a live question and answer session that I'll also be happy to participate in. Let me also make this offer to you. Some people are not comfortable doing live Q&A, so if we run out of time or you prefer not to do the Q&A, I'm putting on the handouts my personal contact information. And if you happen to be listening by phone instead of watching this, I'll just give it to you. You can tweet at Douglas Reeves, just like it sounds, at Douglas, D-O-U-G-L-A-S, Reeves, no space, capital R-E-E-V-E-S. You can email me, douglas.reeves@creativeleadership.net. That's douglas.reeves@creativeleadership.net. You can even text or call me at country code 1-781-710-9633. I pledge to you to give you a personal and respectful answer to every question. I'm not saying that I've got all the answers, but I've seen a thing or two, and after 40 countries of work, maybe I can be of service to you as well. And remember, if ideas like you heard today would be helpful for your educational system, your Ministry of Education, or other groups, we've done, as I said, more than 30,000 participants in the last few months for free. We're happy to help you as well. Thanks so much for your kind attention.